Hi, everybody. This is the Brookline Bees from the Brookline Senior Center, and we're talking about embroidery today. And everybody want to just go around and introduce themselves? Bronwyn, you're on the screen, so go ahead.
Okay, I'm Bronwyn Feeney. I've been a member of the Brookline Bees for, I don't know, 3 or 4 years, I guess. And Joyce is a great teacher. So I'm enjoying learning from her.
All right, Claire?
I'm Claire Weston, and I met Joyce when I was teaching as an instructor for the exercise class.
Great. Hi, Betty?
Hi, I'm Betty Lou. I'm from Brighton. I started going to the Brookline Senior Center back in September. And it's such a the bees have been such a welcoming group, and Joyce has a lot of patience. I haven't sewn for at least 30 years or more, and I was a little nervous. I wasn't able to sew a straight line, but I'm getting better, and I'm enjoying the time and making new friends.
Thank you. And Betty's doing great. Everybody's doing great. And I'm Joyce Graff. And as they said, I'm the instructor. And I have some slides I wanted to show everybody about embroidery this morning. And today we're going to talk about the project. So Bronwyn sent me a couple of samples. This one she sketched from an old pillowcase. Bronwyn, is there anything you want to tell us about this piece?
I can't remember where I got it, but at the time I was doing some type of painting called rose mauling on wood. And this looks to me very similar to the rose mauling designs that are done on wood. It's a Scandinavian craft. And I ended up tracing this from the pillowcase because the pillowcase is so light I could barely see it. I think it was a pillowcase someone was using as a pillowcase and washed it a bunch of times, but never did the embroidery. And I would like to do the pillowcase, and I might use the same design on a little tea towel that I'm making for a small tray that I have.
Great.
It would fit.
Thank you. So that's great. So how would you go ahead and get this design onto the piece of fabric where you want to do the embroidery?
I really don't know how to do that.
Right.
So some kind of pencil would be good.
Yeah. So there are a number of different ways. There's some really good guidance at a website called peacockandfig.com. And I took this image from it to show you. You can trace it very much like you did to copy it out in the first place. You can trace it, and if you're going to put it on the fabric, you can use any one of these kinds of marking pens. What you don't want to do is use any kind of permanent marker. You want something that's going to wash out. So these are some suggestions of different things you can do. The other thing you can do is to trace it onto a piece of what's called stabilizer. That's not intended to be a permanent part of your finished piece, but it helps to keep the fabric nice and firmly straight while you're working. And you can actually embroider down through the stabilizer and then wash it away or tear it away when you're done. And I can show you some pieces of stabilizer when we're back together. But that stabilizer you can see through more easily, so you could trace it onto the stabilizer paper and then put that on top of your fabric so that when you embroider it, you're working down through the stabilizer and the fabric. And then when you're finished, you tear it away. Here's another one that Bronwyn sent me. This one you were saying you cross-stitched with your great-grandmother?
Right. I mean, she did anything that's good on it, she did. I did it when I was 5 or 6 years old with her help. And I particularly would like to know how to do that stitch that makes the lines, because she was such a wonderful seamstress, and she knitted and crocheted and everything. And the face and the neck and the arms are so nice, and the line is so straight. And when I try to do that stitch, it never looks the same, so.
Good morning. Millicent is joining us. And Millicent, just so you know, I do have the recording turned on. Do you want to just tell us your name and a sentence or two about yourself?
Yes, my name is Millicent.
Hi. And Millicent's been another really creative member of this group, and we're glad to have you this morning. Thank you. So back to this piece that Millicent, that Bronwyn did with her great grandmother. This is called cross stitching. She's making X's in a very regular way. And again, how would you transfer this to another piece of fabric? So one suggestion would be first to chart it. So you get a piece of graph paper and you put where are the X's, and they're going to be in this regular format that you see on graph paper here. I put a couple of charts up so you could see what they look like. So you chart it out on a piece of graph paper, and then of course you want some fabric that's going to help you make perfect little X's. So you can either do that on the hard anchor cloth that we talked about last week, or you could do it on a linen or something that has fairly large threads so that you can count the threads and do X's, or you can do a transfer like we just talked about, sketching it on something and transferring that pattern to your finished cloth. So I mentioned the materials needed for the class, piece of fabric, about 9 by 9, just to make it manageable, and some thread or embroidery floss or yarn, and an appropriate needle. So what does that mean? And Bronwyn, you mentioned you have embroidery floss and that it comes with 6 strands. Whoops, went one too far. Can I go back? Yeah. So there's 6 strands in it that come together. And if you're using yarn, there are also more than one strand. The Persian wool that people use for doing needlepoint has 3 strands of wool. And I made up this sample so that you could see that if you use 1 strand of embroidery floss, that's what that top row is. And that's 1 strand. And then I did a row with 2 strands, 1 with 3, 1 with 4. So you can see the line is thicker depending on how many strands I'm using. So it depends on the effect that you're trying to create. You can even vary it, like if you're doing buds on a flower, you might want it skinnier, and if you want a full-blown flower, you want it thicker. So it doesn't have to be consistent throughout your piece. It could be just different for different effects within the piece. And then the yarn ones are even thicker, and you can see how the material was puckering because I was using a fairly thin piece of material, really too thin to do yarn work with. With yarn work, you're usually working on something like a linen or even heavier than that. Needlepoint canvas, if you've ever seen needlepoint canvas, is very stiff. Think, I don't know, tent material. Well, they make tent material these days out of parachute cloth, but the old-fashioned heavy canvas, like think blue jeans, something that heavy. If you
So thick cloth that you can see the warp and the weft.
That's right. That's right. Exactly.
Joyce, looking through my junk, I found this kind of embroidery thread. It's made from the company DMC Moulin Special.
That's right. DMC is very good embroidery cotton. That's right.
Oh, so it's good stuff?
Yes, definitely. It's a beautiful color. And
Like
now notice that it has 2 pieces of paper around it to hold it together.
Yeah.
And you don't take those papers off.
Oh, really?
No, don't take
So you
those papers.
just pull it this way?
You just pull it. It's called a pull skein. And so go ahead, you can pull it and show everybody how that works. that's a nice manageable piece. You don't want it too long because it'll get tangled. And then we decide how many threads you want to work with. And for what we're doing this morning, I'd say use 3.
Do they have special needles for embroidery? You
The
have to get
needle-
a special needle?
Embroidery needles have a long eye.
Oh, that's good, so I can thread it.
Right.
Is this long enough?
Yes, that'll be great. So here you can see I've got an embroidery needle on the picture for you. And you see how that eye is long? And the reason for that is if you have 3 or 6 strands of thread, you're going to be wanting to put them through. You can see they're full like that. And what I do is sort of lick my fingers and wet it a little bit. And then that'll help them stick together a little bit. And then you flatten that out. So now you've got the 3 strands sort of side by side and as close together as you can. And that's what you're going to feed through that eye.
You need three strands?
Yep, I'd say 3 strands.
Oh,
So you'll notice the thread is twisted, right? The thread is twisted. So all those strands are twisted together, but if you untwist it and make it flat, you'll see they're kind of side by side. So you want to
oh yeah.
separate in a way that you've got 3 on one side and 3 on the other side, but they're naturally together.
Yeah, I'm flattening it out.
Okay, so then separate it into 3 and 3. And now you kind of need a third hand. So either you can put the 2 ends in one hand, but hold them separate, and then pull down, put your other finger in the middle and pull it down. The other thing I do sometimes is I use my mouth as my third hand.
Your mouth?
Yeah, so I'll hold one in my mouth and one in my hand and then pull it down.
Do you have to brush your teeth first? Where do you
Even
buy these needles? Can you get them in the dollar store?
Yes, you should be able to. My favorite needles for old ladies threading needles is the gold eye needles. So look for something with a golden eye. It makes better contrast and they're easier to thread. But I use almost exclusively embroidery needles because of that larger eye. It makes it easier to thread no matter what you're doing.
On the package, does it say embroidery?
Yes. They're called embroidery needles, and that specifically means that the eye is long, like that.
Yep. Yeah.
Okay. The sewing needles
I
have
have
just
long eyes.
a tiny little eye, and the embroidery needles have a bigger eye. And the other distinction is sharps versus tapestry needles. So if you're working with cloth, you want a sharp needle because it needs to penetrate the cloth. If you're working with embroidery canvas or something, then you need to have a blunt needle so that you don't split the thread. Millicent, I'm sorry, your microphone's on now. What was it you wanted to say?
That sometimes when I threaded needles, sewing machine needle, usually I use a needle threader, this needle threader right here. I use this to thread my needle. This little silver metal wire goes through the needle, and then the thread goes inside this thing here, and then I pull out the needle through, and that's how the needle get threaded. Same thing with sewing the sewing machine. Sometimes I use a magnifying glass to thread my needle.
Good ideas. Yeah, and the needle threaders do work better with embroidery needles because it's a bigger eye and it's easier.
Yes, it's better than just using saliva.
That's true. I
with the needle.
especially when we're worrying about germs, but you know, if you're sharing materials with somebody else, don't use your mouth for a third hand, but I do. I have to confess. Okay, let me go back to the slide here.
Millicent looks very pretty today.
Yeah, I
Thank
like
you.
that color.
Thank you. Thank you.
Looks like a coral.
Claire. Thank you,
Very
Claire.
pretty color.
Okay, so back to the pictures here. You'll
Ooh,
That's
pretty.
beautiful.
hoop. Yes, and we're going to learn all the stitches that are in this piece today, by the way. So you'll be able to do a design like that if you want to. But this is a hoop, an embroidery hoop, nice and firmly straight so that you can work on it more easily. We're not going to use a hoop today, but the principle and the reason that you might use a hoop is that you want to keep the fabric taut, but not stretched, not distorted. And you want to keep your threads snug so that they're going to lie flat on your finished piece, but again, not stretched. You don't want to stretch it too tight. And I think you get a better feel for it if you don't use a hoop. That's why we're going to work without a hoop today. But you don't want to distort the fabric. You don't want to skew the fabric. If you were working with a piece of stabilizer, like your design is on the stabilizer, then you would put the stabilizer also under that hoop so that it's being held together nice and firmly. There are different kinds of hoops, and it depends what you're working with. When you're working with fabric, you usually use a round one. And for needlepoint and other canvases, the really heavy fabrics we talked about, that where you might be doing yarn embroidery, there are square hoops that you can do, and you would just wind your piece around one corner of that. So let's design a project. And Bronwyn talked about wanting to do curvy lines. So here's my little drawing. You can draw anything you like, but you want one curvy line, like the stem of my flower, and then a couple of leaves or petals. And we're going to put some dots in the middle of that flower, some French knots. And you can draw it with anything, whatever you've got there, a pencil. Ultimately, if you were doing this to be a really finished piece, you would do it with something that's going to wash out. Pencil is fine, chalk is fine. There are lots and lots of fabric markers that you can get. Some will wash out and so forth. I did mine with a big fat permanent marker so that you could see it really well, but obviously that's a bad choice if it's for real.